My name is Casper Hope. I'm 36 years old. For most of my adult life, I have been a wife, a strategist, and the kind of woman people describe as steady. Not exciting, not dramatic, not difficult, steady from the outside. My life looked like a photograph you'd frame and hang in a hallway, clean lines, warm lighting, two people building something respectable together. I married young, not recklessly, but optimistically. I believed in partnership the way some people believe in gravity. It wasn't something you question. It simply holds everything in place. People often underestimate women like me. I don't speak over others. I don't compete for attention in a room. I listen, I notice, I remember. And because I'm quiet, people assume I'm comfortable. Because I'm patient, they assume I'll always wait. Because I forgive easily. They assume I won't reach a limit. This story isn't about betrayal in the dramatic sense. There was no scandal, no screaming, no sudden disaster. It's about erosion. It's about what happens when you slowly become smaller inside your own life. When you begin to adjust your personality to fit someone else's comfort zone. When you start calling your own exhaustion maturity. And one night, standing in my kitchen under the yellow light above the stove, I realized something I could not unknow. I left my marriage the night I realized I was losing myself to save us. That sentence sounds decisive. It wasn't. It felt terrifying and selfish. Choosing myself felt selfish until it felt necessary. In this story, I'm not going to paint myself as a victim. I won't turn my husband into a villain. Real life is more subtle than that. What I will do is show you the small moments, the overlooked conversations, the tiny dismissals, the compromises that seemed harmless at first. I will show you how silence can slowly turn into self-erasure. And I will show you how reclaiming yourself doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it looks like paperwork, or a packed bag, or a calm conversation at a dining table where one person has already left emotionally weeks before they say the words out loud. This is not a story about revenge. It's about clarity. It's about realizing that love should not require you to disappear. And if you've ever wondered whether staying strong means staying silent, I want to ask you something gently. Before we begin, have you ever felt yourself shrinking just to keep the peace before I understood I was disappearing? I was exactly who everyone needed me to be. At work, I was the composed one, the marketing director who could step into a tense meeting and translate chaos into structure. I was the person who listened longer than everyone else, the one who took notes no one realized would matter later. My colleagues trusted me because I didn't react impulsively. I absorbed, processed, and then responded. At home, I was similar. My husband used to introduce me at dinners with a smile that sounded affectionate but carried something else underneath. This is Casper. She keeps me grounded. She's the organized one. I'd be lost without her. Everyone would laugh. I laughed too. What no one noticed was that grounded slowly turned into stationary. Organized turned into responsible for everything. Lost without her became, I don't have to pay attention, because she will. I wasn't invisible in the dramatic sense. I was appreciated, complimented, trusted, but appreciation can sometimes be a cage if it defines you too narrowly. When guests came over, I set the table, planned the meals, remembered dietary restrictions, and kept conversations flowing when they stalled. If my husband forgot an anniversary gift for someone close to us, I would quietly order it the next morning and sign both our names. When bills arrived, I handled them. When vacations were planned, I researched them. It felt efficient, logical, mature. He would say, "You're just better at this stuff." And I believed him, because being better meant I didn't have to ask him to grow. At family gatherings, I was the calm daughter-in-law who never created friction. When opinions clashed, I smiled and changed the subject. When someone made an offhand comment that could have become a spark, I absorbed it. "You're so patient," they would say. Patience is admirable, but patience without boundaries becomes permission. What I didn't see at the time was how my identity was slowly becoming functional instead of personal. I was useful, I was reliable, I was stable, but who was I beyond what I managed? If I was tired, I reframed it as stress. If I felt unseen, I told myself I was overthinking. If I wanted something different, I postponed it. There is a subtle praise that women like me often receive. She's low maintenance. She doesn't nag. She understands. Understanding can become a silent contract. It says, I will absorb what you don't want to deal with. And I did, without complaint, not because I was weak, because I believed partnership meant balancing weaknesses. If he were ambitious and scattered, I would be steady and strategic. If he were expressive and impulsive, I would be thoughtful and measured. It felt complementary, but somewhere along the way, complementary became compensatory. When he made decisions without consulting me, small ones, at first I told myself it wasn't worth correcting. When he interrupted me mid-sentence in front of friends, I laughed it off. When he forgot plans I had mentioned twice, I adjusted. None of it was catastrophic. That's the part that makes stories like mine harder to recognize. There was no explosion, just small redefinitions of who I was allowed to be. I became the woman who didn't need reassurance, the woman who didn't demand attention, the woman who would understand. And the truth is, I wore that identity proudly for years because it felt mature, because it felt like love, because I believed strength meant absorbing impact without flinching. What I didn't understand yet was this. If you are always the stable one, the accommodating one, the calm one, eventually, no one asks how you're holding up. They assume you're built to endure. And I was, until I wasn't. The first cut wasn't loud. It didn't come with raised voices or slammed doors. No one would have circled it on a calendar and said, that's where it began. But I remember it. It was a Thursday evening in early spring. I had stayed late at work finishing a presentation that could potentially move me into a regional leadership role. It wasn't just another project. It was something I had quietly worked toward for 3 years. That night, I told him over dinner, not dramatically, just gently, they're considering me for the regional strategy position. I said, trying to keep my tone neutral, it would mean a bigger team, more responsibility. He nodded while scrolling through his phone. That's great, he said. But wouldn't that be a lot with everything else? Everything else? I waited for him to look up. He didn't. I told myself he was tired. I told myself timing matters. So I tried again. It's a big opportunity. And this time he looked up, smiling. But it was the kind of smile you give a child who wants to rearrange the living room furniture. Cass, he said softly, we're already stretched. If you take on more, who's going to handle, you know, everything? He gestured vaguely around the kitchen. The groceries I had bought, the bills I had paid, the weekend plans I had arranged, the life I had curated. He didn't say it unkindly. That's what made it confusing. He framed it as concern. I just don't want you to burn out, he added. Burnout, as if ambition and exhaustion were interchangeable. I felt something small and sharp in my chest. Not anger, not even hurt. Recognition. I had supported his promotions without hesitation. When his hours increased, I adjusted. When he traveled, I compensated. When he wanted to invest in a new venture, I helped him build the projections. I never once asked who would handle everything, because I already was. But in that moment, the equation was clear. My growth required negotiation. He did not. I remember nodding, smiling, saying, that's fair. I'll think about it. And I did think about it. That night, lying in bed beside him while he slept, I replayed the conversation over and over, not for what he said, but for what I felt. It wasn't that he opposed my success. It was that he assumed my primary function was to maintain stability around him, and I had trained him to think that way. That realization was uncomfortable because the first small cut wasn't entirely his. It was the consequence of years of quiet accommodation. Still, something shifted inside me. I noticed how quickly my dreams became logistical discussions, how naturally my aspirations were weighed against household harmony, how easily I accepted the idea that my ambition might inconvenience the structure. The next morning, I declined the regional role. I told my manager I wasn't ready for that scale yet. She looked surprised. You'd be excellent, she said carefully. I know, I replied, and I meant it. But excellence, I was learning, requires room. And I had quietly confined myself to a space that didn't stretch. That was the first small cut. No blood. No witnesses. Just a thin line across my sense of self. Everyone else had forgotten that conversation by the next week. I didn't, because it was the first time I realized I was being measured not by who I could become, but by how well I could maintain what already existed. After that Thursday, nothing dramatic changed. That's how normalization works. It doesn't announce itself. It settles in quietly and rearranges your expectations. I told myself I had made a rational decision. That leadership roles would come again. That timing mattered. That partnership required compromise. And for a while, I believed it. But once you've seen the pattern, you start noticing it everywhere. It showed up in conversations. If we were out with friends and I began telling a story, he would gently interrupt to clarify a detail. She means the trip in May, not June. No, Cass. That's not exactly how it happened. It sounded harmless, precise, almost helpful. Except that the corrections were rarely necessary. They shifted attention, redirected the narrative, subtly reframed me as slightly inaccurate, slightly mistaken, slightly less authoritative in my own experience. I would smile and adjust. It's not worth it. I'd tell myself. Then it showed up in decisions. He signed us up for a weekend event without asking. When I pointed out that I had already planned something else, he sighed not angrily, just disappointed. You're always so rigid about plans, he said. Can't we be spontaneous? Spontaneity, in our marriage, meant adapting to his preferences. Structure meant protecting mine. I began editing myself before speaking, before suggesting, before correcting, not because I was afraid of him, because I was tired of being the one who complicated things. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from constantly recalibrating your tone, softening your suggestions, pre-justifying your needs, reducing your sentences to avoid being too intense. And I was good at it. That's the dangerous part. I was so good at managing emotional temperature that even I couldn't tell when it started costing me. One evening, we were discussing finances. I had noticed a recurring expense that didn't align with our long-term goals. I brought it up calmly, presenting numbers, options, and adjustments. He leaned back in his chair and laughed not cruelly, just lightly. You think about this stuff way too much, he said. Relax. We're fine. We're fine. 2 words that ended conversations. 2 words that implied my vigilance was unnecessary. I went quiet, not because I agreed, because pushing further would make me the anxious one. Over time, that became the pattern. If I pressed, I was overthinking. If I insisted, I was controlling. If I stepped back, I was easygoing. Guess which role felt safer? I began to internalize it. Maybe I am too structured. Maybe I do take things too seriously. Maybe harmony matters more than precision. And harmony did matter to me. But harmony without reciprocity isn't peace. It's performance. I was performing understanding, performing flexibility, performing contentment, and because I didn't cry, or raise my voice, or withdraw dramatically, no one would have labeled it disrespect. But dismissal doesn't need to be loud to be real. It can look like a smile that overrides your point, a joke that undermines your concern, a pattern of decisions that assumes you'll adjust. I adjusted again and again, until one day, I realized something unsettling. I could predict exactly how he would respond before he spoke. Not because I knew him deeply, but because the script had stopped evolving. And in that script, I was supportive, reasonable, adaptable, but never centered. That's how disrespect becomes normalized. It disguises itself as personality differences, as harmless dynamics, as that's just how we are. And because I never made a scene, because I never escalated, because I remained calm, no one questioned it. Not even me. Not yet. There's a moment in every long relationship when you realize you're no longer interacting with each other. You're interacting with the roles you've built. And by then, those roles feel permanent. In our marriage, I wasn't Casper anymore. I was the reliable one, the stabilizer, the planner, the emotional regulator. If something went wrong, I handled it. If tension surfaced, I diffused it. If decisions needed to be made, I researched them, quietly, efficiently. At first, I wore that role with pride. Reliability feels noble. It feels adult. It feels strong. But over time, it became less of a choice and more of an assignment. I noticed it during small everyday moments. If we were running late, he wouldn't rush. He would glance at me, because subconsciously, it was my responsibility to manage time. If paperwork needed reviewing, it slid across the table toward my side. If friends needed advice, they would text me, even when the issue involved him. It wasn't malicious. It was structural, and structures are powerful because no one remembers building them. One evening, we were invited to dinner with his colleagues. Before we left, he said, almost casually, just keep things light tonight. Okay. They don't really need the deep analysis. I paused. He said it with a smile, but there it was. The expectation. Be charming, be pleasant, be impressive, but not intimidating. I nodded. Of course I did, because part of me still believed partnership meant adjusting presentation for shared benefit. At dinner, I listened more than I spoke. When I did speak, I softened my phrasing. I avoided complex opinions. I laughed at jokes that didn't quite land. I watched him shine, and I supported it. On the drive home, he squeezed my hand. "You were perfect," he said. Perfect. I stared out the window at the blurred streetlights and realized something quietly devastating. Perfect meant unobtrusive. Perfect meant not challenging. Perfect meant making him feel centered. And I had been so focused on being good at marriage that I never stopped to ask whether the role itself was sustainable. I began noticing how often my needs were postponed for later. My career advancement later. My personal projects later. My rest later. Because stability had become my primary function. And I was excellent at it. But excellence without acknowledgement becomes expectation. Expectation without appreciation becomes entitlement. Not loud entitlement, subtle entitlement, the kind that assumes you will always show up in the same way. If I ever hesitated, if I didn't immediately volunteer to fix something, there was confusion. "Is everything okay?" he would ask. Translation: "Why aren't you being you?" But the version of me they recognized wasn't the full version. It was the curated one, the edited one, the endlessly composed one. And slowly, I started asking myself a question that felt disloyal, even to think. If I stopped performing this role, would there still be space for me here? Or would the system collapse? That question frightened me, because if the answer was collapse, then I wasn't loved for who I was. I was valued for what I maintained. And the difference between those two things is everything. That was when I understood something critical. I hadn't been silenced. I had been assigned, and I had agreed, without realizing that the role I accepted required me to disappear in small, daily increments. The shift didn't happen during an argument. It didn't happen during a dramatic revelation. It happened on a Tuesday. Ordinary, quiet, unremarkable. I was standing in the kitchen at 9:47 p.m., the overhead light casting that familiar yellow glow across the counter. The dishwasher hummed softly. My husband was in the living room, laughing at something on television. I had just finished cleaning up after a dinner I barely tasted. And for the first time, I didn't feel tired. I felt absent, not physically. I was there, hands in warm water, plates stacked, routine intact. But internally, it was as if I was watching myself from across the room. I noticed how efficiently I moved, how instinctively I wiped the counter twice, not once, how automatically I checked the calendar on the fridge for the next day's obligations. It was muscle memory. And then a thought surfaced, not loud, not emotional, just clear. If I disappeared tomorrow, how long would it take for anyone to notice the difference between me and the system I maintain? That question didn't make me cry. It didn't make me angry. It made me still, because I realized something unsettling. I had become infrastructure. Reliable, necessary, but replaceable in function. And that's when it clicked. I had been trying to save us for years, smoothing tension, anticipating needs, preventing conflict before it surfaces, adjusting myself to protect harmony. But I hadn't asked whether us included me anymore. Not the efficient version, not the composed one, the full version. The ambitious one who once stayed up until 2 a.m. drafting ideas just because they were exciting. The opinionated one who loved intellectual debate. The woman who used to take up space without rehearsing her tone. Somewhere along the way, I had equated peace with reduction. If I'm smaller, things run smoother. And they did, but smooth isn't the same as alive. That Tuesday night, I didn't confront him. I didn't announce a crisis. I didn't even change my routine. I dried the last plate. I turned off the kitchen light. I walked into the living room and sat beside him. He leaned into me naturally, comfortably, and I realized something quietly irreversible. I felt more alone next to him than I ever had by myself. That wasn't his fault entirely. It wasn't mine entirely either. It was the accumulated result of years of unspoken negotiations. I stayed awake longer than usual that night, not spiraling, assessing. I began mentally listing the things that were mine: my income, my savings, my professional network, my skills, my emotional resilience. For the first time, I wasn't asking, "How do I fix this?" I was asking, "If this never changes, can I live like this for another decade?" And the answer arrived without drama. No, that was the shift. Not anger, not betrayal. Clarity? I didn't want to leave him. I wanted to stop leaving myself. And suddenly, I understood something I had avoided admitting. Choosing myself would feel selfish, but continuing like this would feel like self-erasure. That night in the kitchen, under a yellow light no one would remember, I stopped trying to be perfect. I started trying to be honest, with myself first. Everything after that unfolded quietly, but the decision began there, in stillness. After that Tuesday, nothing outwardly changed, which is why no one noticed. I still woke up early, still answered emails before breakfast, still made dinner most nights. But internally, something had shifted from endurance to evaluation. My silence was no longer automatic. It was intentional. When he interrupted me during a conversation the following weekend, I didn't rush to correct him. I simply stopped speaking and let the moment hang, not dramatically, not accusingly, just quiet. He didn't notice. Others filled the space. For the first time, I observed without compensating. That became my experiment. What happens if I stop smoothing everything? If I don't preemptively fix the small oversights? If I let him handle the social RSVP he promised to send? The answer was predictable. Some things were forgotten, some deadlines were missed, some awkwardness surfaced. And instead of stepping in, I watched. Not vindictively, scientifically. I needed data. For years, I had believed that I was preserving stability out of love. Now I wanted to see whether the structure could hold without my constant reinforcement. When he forgot to confirm plans with friends, and we showed up late, he blamed traffic. I didn't interject to clarify that he'd never sent the confirmation. When a bill went unpaid because I hadn't reminded him it was his turn, he seemed surprised. "Oh, I thought you handled this one." I looked at him calmly. "I usually do." Usually? That word landed differently. He shrugged, mildly inconvenienced, then paid it. There was no fight, no accusation, just subtle discomfort, and I realized something powerful. For the first time, I wasn't protecting him from consequence. I wasn't punishing him either. I was withdrawing excess labor. There's a difference. In the past, silence meant suppression. Now it meant space. Space to see the truth without interference. Space to feel the imbalance without immediately correcting it. And interestingly, he interpreted my quiet differently. "You've been distant lately?" he said one evening. Not cruelly, curious. I considered explaining everything. The years of adjustment, the deferred opportunities, the Tuesday night realization. But explanations are invitations for negotiation. And I was no longer negotiating with myself. "I've just been thinking," I replied. That was true. Silence became strategic. I listened more carefully to how he spoke about our future, the assumptions embedded in his language, the way he said we when discussing his goals, and you when discussing adjustments. I started tracking patterns in my leather-bound planner, not complaints, not grievances, observations, dates, conversations, financial flows, career projections. Not because I was planning revenge, because clarity requires evidence, and evidence requires attention. The more I withdrew unnecessary effort, the more I understood how much invisible weight I had been carrying. He mistook my restraint for mood, for stress, for temporary distance. He didn't see it for what it was, preparation. Silence is often interpreted as weakness, but sometimes it's recalibration. I wasn't collapsing, I was repositioning. And the most surprising part, without the constant effort of managing everything, I felt lighter, not happier, not relieved, but more present inside my own mind. For years, I had been reacting. Now I was observing, and once you begin observing honestly, it becomes very difficult to return to unconscious participation. That was when I knew this wasn't a phase. It was the beginning of a deliberate path, one he couldn't see yet. Preparation doesn't look dramatic. It looks like ordinary life is continuing. That's why no one saw it. I didn't hire a lawyer immediately. I didn't confront him with ultimatums. I didn't even say the word separation out loud. What I did was quieter. I started with information. Late at night, after he fell asleep, I would sit at the kitchen table with my laptop open, not searching how to leave a marriage, but reviewing practical realities. Our joint accounts, our shared investments, the mortgage terms, insurance policies. Not to dismantle them, to understand them fully. I had always been financially literate. I handled our budgeting system. I tracked long-term projections. But there's a difference between managing a shared future and evaluating your independent capacity. I opened a separate savings account in my name. It wasn't secretive. It wasn't illegal. It was simply private. Each month, I redirected a portion of my income into it small enough not to disrupt anything, large enough to matter over time. I updated my resume, not because I planned to quit my job, because I needed to remember my value outside of us. I reconnected with former colleagues, had coffee meetings framed as casual catch-ups, strengthened professional relationships I had allowed to quieten over the years. None of this looked suspicious. It looked like growth, which it was. At home, I observed more than I spoke. I stopped volunteering for tasks automatically. When something needed to be done, I waited to see whether he would notice. Sometimes he did. Often, he didn't. I wrote everything down. Not emotionally, factually. If we discussed long-term plans, I noted who initiated them and who adjusted. If we talked about finances, I recorded the tone and outcome. Not because I expected conflict, because I wanted clarity free from memory distortion. When you've spent years minimizing your own discomfort, it becomes easy to gaslight yourself. Maybe it's not that unbalanced. Maybe I'm being dramatic. Maybe I'm tired. Documentation quiets that internal doubt. I also began something more subtle emotional detachment, not coldness, distance. When he spoke about his next promotion, I supported him, but I didn't internalize the logistics. I didn't immediately start calculating how it would impact our schedule. I let him outline his own plan. When he forgot something important, I didn't soften the edges afterward. I let the silence sit. At first, he interpreted this as moodiness. "You seem different," he said once, studying me. "I'm just focusing on work." I replied, that wasn't a lie. Work had become something else for me. It wasn't just a career. It was proof that I could function independently, that my competence wasn't relational. I began spending more time outside the housework events, solo walks, gym sessions I had postponed for years, not to escape him, to reconnect with myself. And here's what no one tells you about quiet preparation. It changes how you carry yourself. There's a subtle shift in posture when you know you have options, when staying becomes a choice, not a necessity. He didn't notice the savings account. He didn't notice the revised resume. He didn't notice that I had begun reviewing state laws about property division, not obsessively, just responsibly. What he did notice was that I stopped reacting, and because he had grown accustomed to my emotional responsiveness, my neutrality unsettled him more than confrontation ever would have. Preparation is not revenge, it is reclamation. Each small action restored a fraction of something I had surrendered. Autonomy, agency, perspective. By the time I realized how far I had quietly come, I understood something essential. I was no longer asking whether I could leave. I was calculating whether staying still aligned with who I was becoming. And that is a very different question. There wasn't a single document that changed everything. There wasn't a shocking discovery or hidden betrayal. The reveal was quieter than that. It happened on a Saturday afternoon while he was out meeting friends. I sat at the dining table with my planner open, bank statements arranged neatly beside me. Sunlight filtered through the blinds in narrow strips across the wood. I wasn't searching for something dramatic. I was verifying patterns. Over the previous months, I had been tracking our financial flow more carefully, not suspiciously, just objectively. I compared contributions, expenditures, long-term projections, risk exposure. And what I saw wasn't misconduct. It was an imbalance, not just in money, in ownership. Most of our assets were structured around his trajectory, his career moves, his investments, his tax strategy. My income supported stability, but it wasn't positioned for growth the same way. Because when those decisions were made, I had prioritized flexibility. For him, I leaned back in my chair and exhaled slowly. For years, I believed I was protecting our future, but the architecture favored his expansion. Mine maintained it. That realization didn't make me angry. It made it clear. I opened my separate account dashboard and reviewed the balance. It wasn't enormous, but it was sufficient. Combined with my income and career standing, it meant something undeniable. I could sustain myself comfortably, without scrambling, without fear, and more importantly, I could do so without destroying him. That mattered to me. I didn't want revenge. I didn't want to destabilize his life the way I had destabilized myself internally. I just wanted a choice. Then came the deeper reveal. It wasn't financial. It was emotional. As I reviewed my notes, months of conversations, tone shifts, repeated dismissals, I noticed something subtle. I had stopped hoping, not loving, hoping. There's a difference. Love can exist even when things are strained. But hope requires evidence of change, and there hadn't been any, not because he was cruel, because he was comfortable, and comfort resists evolution. I closed the planner and sat very still. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine leaving not as an escape, not as an act of protest. As a continuation of growth, I imagined waking up in a smaller apartment, making coffee in silence, planning my week based solely on my ambitions, accepting that regional leadership role if it came again. The image didn't scare me, it steadied me. That was the reveal. I wasn't trapped, I was choosing to stay, and if staying was a choice, then leaving could be one too. That reframed everything. Victims feel stuck, partners feel obligated, but autonomous adults choose. I realized I had been waiting for something dramatic enough to justify departure, an affair, a betrayal, a shouting match. But sometimes the absence of growth is reason enough. Sometimes slow self-erasure qualifies. I looked around the house that afternoon. The furniture we chose together, the framed photos, the layered history. I didn't feel rage. I felt gratitude and completion, not because the marriage was a mistake, but because I had evolved beyond the version of myself that built it. That private clarity changed the air in the room. When he came home later that evening, he kissed my forehead like he always did. And for the first time, I didn't feel anchored by it. I felt informed. I knew something he didn't. Not a secret, a direction. And that kind of knowledge is silent power. People assume the decision to leave a marriage is explosive. In reality, it can feel like standing at a quiet intersection with multiple exits, each one viable, each one permanent in its own way. After that Saturday afternoon, I didn't rush. Clarity doesn't demand speed, it demands integrity. I gave myself weeks, not to reconsider my worth, but to examine my options honestly. Option 1, stay exactly as things were. No confrontation, no disruption, continue performing stability. Accept that this was the structure of our marriage and let ambition shrink accordingly. It was the easiest path externally. Internally, it felt like slow corrosion. Option 2, confront and renegotiate. Lay everything out, the years of imbalance, the dismissed conversations, the financial architecture that favored his trajectory. Ask for therapy. Demand structural change. This option had hope inside it, but it also had a risk. Because a change requested under threat of departure can become temporary compliance rather than transformation. I asked myself a difficult question. If he changed tomorrow, if he apologized sincerely, restructured responsibilities, supported my career aggressively, would I trust it? I sat with that, and I realized something unsettling. My trust wasn't broken. My alignment was, even if he evolved, I had already crossed an internal threshold. I was no longer willing to prove my worth inside a structure that required me to shrink first. Option 3, leave. Not in anger, not impulsively, but decisively. Leaving would create shockwaves. Families would ask questions. Friends would speculate. He would be confused, perhaps hurt, in ways he didn't anticipate. But leaving would also create space for both of us to confront who we were without the dynamic we had built. I didn't make the decision during a fight. I made it on a quiet Wednesday morning before work. I was standing in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusting my blazer. He was still asleep. I looked at my reflection and asked myself something simple. If you stay, will you respect yourself 5 years from now? The answer arrived immediately. No, and that was enough. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't fueled by rage. It was anchored in self-recognition. I had spent years choosing us in subtle, daily ways. Now I had to choose myself once and for all. I walked into the kitchen, poured coffee, and opened my planner. Instead of writing reminders for shared responsibilities, I began outlining a timeline. Consult an attorney quietly, review housing options, clarify asset division expectations, prepare conversation structure. Not scripts, structure. Because I didn't intend to accuse, I intended to inform. That distinction matters. By the time he woke up and joined me at the table, nothing looked different. We talked about schedules, weekend plans, a mutual friend's birthday. He reached for my hand casually, and I realized something profound. He thought we were stable, because I had maintained the illusion of stability for so long. That realization didn't harden me, it steadied me. Leaving wouldn't be punishment, it would be the truth. And truth, when delivered calmly, is irreversible. That Wednesday morning, without announcing it to anyone, I chose the irreversible path. Not because I hated him, because I finally refused to abandon myself. Once the decision was made, everything became procedural. Not cold, not detached, just deliberate. I scheduled a consultation with an attorney during my lunch break 2 weeks later. I chose someone recommended through a colleague professional. Discreet, pragmatic. I didn't walk into that office trembling. I walked in informed. I laid out the financial structure clearly: joint accounts, property ownership, investment distribution, income breakdown. I had documentation organized chronologically, neatly tabbed in a folder. The attorney looked at me for a moment and said, almost gently, "You've done your homework." I nodded. I prefer clarity. I replied, "We discussed state guidelines, asset division norms, timelines, emotional realities. There was no strategy to win. The only strategy is to separate cleanly." I asked specific questions. What is fair? What is reasonable? What protects both of us long term? Because even in departure, my moral code remained intact. Never humiliate, never escalate, leave with dignity. After that meeting, I didn't rush home. I sat in my car for 10 minutes and simply breathed. Not out of panic, out of acknowledgement. This was real. Over the following weeks, I took additional steps quietly. I secured an apartment across the city, not extravagant, not symbolic, practical, close to work, minimal commute. I adjusted my direct deposit to increase contributions to my independent account. I copied essential documents, tax returns, mortgage paperwork, insurance policies, storing them digitally and securely. At home, nothing outwardly shifted. I still cooked, still asked about his day, still listened when he spoke about upcoming projects. But internally, I had already stepped outside the shared narrative. There's a strange calm that comes when you're no longer negotiating your own needs. Conversations that once would have triggered quiet resentment now felt observational. When he mentioned considering a career move that would require relocation, I didn't instinctively start calculating how I'd adjust my job. I simply said, "That's something you'll need to evaluate carefully." He looked at me, slightly puzzled. "You mean we'll evaluate?" he corrected. I held his gaze gently. "We'll talk about it," I said. "Precision matters." He didn't press. He didn't sense the shift fully, because the external choreography remained intact. That's the thing about moving in silence. It doesn't look like rebellion. It looks like routine. I began slowly transferring personal items, books, sentimental objects, clothes I hadn't worn in years, into neatly packed boxes stored in my car trunk, under the pretense of seasonal organization. There was no thrill in it, no satisfaction, just inevitability. At night, lying beside him, I didn't feel bitterness. I felt distance, not emotional hostility, completion. The version of me who built this life had done her best, but I had evolved beyond the role she accepted. And the most surprising part, he seemed slightly unsettled, not because of anything visible, but because my emotional temperature had stabilized in a way he couldn't interpret. I wasn't frustrated. I wasn't reactive. I wasn't negotiating. I was calm. And calm without compliance is disorienting to someone accustomed to your constant adjustment. Still, he didn't ask the question directly. He didn't suspect paperwork had already begun. He didn't know timelines were forming. He believed we were fine, because until that moment, I had always ensured we appeared fine. This time, I wasn't managing perception. I was managing the transition. And when you move with intention instead of impulse, even irreversible decisions unfold quietly. The first consequence wasn't the conversation. It was the absence of my anticipation. When you stop preempting someone's needs, they begin to feel friction in places they didn't know you were cushioning. It started small. He missed a deadline at work because he forgot an early meeting I would usually remind him about. That evening, he was irritated not at me directly, just at the day. "I don't know why I've been so scattered lately," he said, loosening his tie. "Everything feels slightly off." I nodded. I didn't absorb it. A week later, his mother called to ask about a family gathering. I handed him the phone instead of answering logistical questions on his behalf. "You're better at coordinating this stuff," he said, half laughing. "I'm sure you can handle it," I replied calmly. He did, but awkwardly. These weren't catastrophic failures. They were inconvenience, but inconvenience exposes dependency. He began asking more frequently, "Are we okay?" That question had layers, not accusatory, uneasy. Yes, I would say, and technically, we were. There was no conflict, no hostility, just distance. He noticed I stopped initiating conversations about long-term plans, stopped reminding him about small responsibilities, stopped smoothing social dynamics before they escalated. At first, he interpreted it as stress. "You're working too much," he suggested one night. "I'm working intentionally," I corrected gently. That word lingered. Intentionally? There's something destabilizing about realizing someone no longer orbits you emotionally. He began compensating in subtle ways, bringing home flowers unexpectedly, suggesting date nights, and asking more questions about my day. And for a moment, I studied myself carefully. Was this what I wanted? Effort, attention, adjustment. But I recognized something important. This wasn't organic growth. It was a reaction to distance. And reaction fades once comfort returns. I responded kindly, but I didn't lean back into old patterns. When he asked about my upcoming career review, I answered honestly. When he suggested a spontaneous weekend trip, I checked my schedule instead of automatically clearing it. The power dynamic was shifting not aggressively, just structurally. For the first time, he was uncertain, and uncertainty creates awareness. One evening, sitting across from me at dinner, he said quietly, "I feel like you're somewhere else lately." I met his eyes. "I've been thinking about the future," I said. He smiled faintly. "That's normal." "Yes," I agreed. "It is." What he didn't understand yet was that my version of future no longer automatically included the existing framework. Consequences aren't always dramatic explosions. Sometimes they are subtle recalibrations of energy. He felt the loss of my anticipation before he understood the reason for it. He felt the absence of my invisible labor. He felt the quiet gap where my emotional reassurance used to be. But because I hadn't accused, hadn't confronted, hadn't demanded, he didn't know how to fix what he couldn't name. And that's the paradox. When you leave loudly, people defend. When you withdraw quietly, they destabilize. I wasn't punishing him. I was no longer compensating for him. And slowly, he began to sense that something foundational was shifting. He just didn't know that the foundation had already been restructured. The conversation didn't begin with a confession. It began with a question. It was late, almost midnight. We had just returned from dinner with friends. He had been unusually attentive all evening, refilling my glass, asking about my work in front of others, laughing a little too easily at things I said. When we walked through the front door, he didn't turn on the lights immediately. "Cass," he said softly in the dim entryway, "are you unhappy?" There it was. Not anger, not an accusation. Fear. I set my bag down carefully. "I've been thinking," I replied. "That's what scares me," he admitted, half smiling, but not quite. We moved into the living room, sat across from each other. No raised voices, no pacing, just space. "I feel like I'm losing you," he said. The irony of that sentence almost made me laugh, but not cruelly. Gently, "I felt like I lost myself a long time ago," I said. That was the first time I said it out loud. He leaned forward, confused. "What does that mean? Why didn't you tell me?" I considered that. "I did," I said quietly, just not dramatically. I explained not as a list of grievances, not as evidence presented in court, as a pattern, how my career decisions had slowly bent around his, how responsibilities had defaulted to me, how conversations ended with "we're fine" instead of a resolution. He listened, really listened, for the first time in years, and that was the painful part, because now that he was paying attention, I could see the genuine shock in his face. "I had no idea you felt that way," he said. "I know," I replied. That was the problem. He stood up, began pacing slightly, not aggressively, but unsettled. "Okay," he said quickly. "We can fix this. We can rebalance things. I can step up more. You should have pushed me." There it was. Push me. As if it had been my responsibility to escalate enough for him to notice. "I don't want to push you into being my partner," I said calmly. "I wanted you to choose to be." Silence settled heavily between us. He ran a hand through his hair. "So what are you saying?" I inhaled slowly. "I've already spoken to an attorney." The words didn't echo. They landed. His body stilled. "You're serious?" "Yes." There was no shouting, no dramatic collapse. Just dawning realization. "Casper, we can go to therapy. We can start over." And I believed he meant it. But starting over requires two people who haven't already emotionally detached. "I don't want to rebuild something that required me to disappear," I said softly. His voice cracked not loudly, just subtly. "I didn't know." "I know," I repeated, and in that repetition was the entire tragedy. He didn't know because I had been too composed, too patient, too adaptable. And now that he understood, it was already too late. Not because I was unforgiving, but because clarity once reached, doesn't reverse itself out of sympathy. He sat back down, stunned. I thought we were stable, he whispered. We were stable, I said, but I wasn't. That was the line he couldn't argue with. The panic wasn't explosive. It was internal, visible in the way he stared at the floor, in the way his breathing changed, in the way he realized that the quiet woman he relied on had made the loudest decision of her life without raising her voice. And the most devastating part, there was nothing to fight. No betrayal, no villain. Just evolution, and evolution doesn't negotiate backward. The days after that conversation were eerily calm. No slammed doors, no icy silence, no dramatic ultimatums. Just two adults moving carefully around the truth. He didn't beg. He didn't accuse. He tried to understand. We sat at the dining table again 2 nights later, same place I had reviewed financial documents weeks before. The symmetry wasn't lost on me. I keep replaying everything, he said quietly, trying to figure out where I missed it. I folded my hands together on the table. You didn't miss a single moment, I replied. You missed the pattern. He nodded slowly, absorbing that. That's worse, he admitted. There was no hostility in the room, just gravity. He asked practical questions first about timelines, about logistics, about what separation would actually look like. I answered clearly. The apartment, the legal process, asset division expectations. No threats, no inflated demands. Fairness. He looked at me at one point and said, almost disoriented, "You've thought this through." Yes. For how long? Long enough to know I'm not reacting. That mattered to him, because reaction can be negotiated. Deliberation cannot. At one point, he said something that could have turned the conversation defensive. You should have told me it was this serious. I held his gaze. I shouldn't have had to convince you to take me seriously. The sentence was calm, not sharp, but precise. He exhaled, recognizing the truth inside it. There was a moment, a brief one, where I saw the version of us that could have evolved earlier. The version where he noticed without being prompted, where I spoke before resentment formed. But that version required a different timeline, and we were no longer inside it. He didn't try to rewrite history. He didn't blame my ambition. He didn't minimize my feelings. And that almost made it harder, because if he had been cruel, this would have been simpler. Instead, he was human, flawed, comfortable, unaware. I don't want to lose you, he said eventually. I don't want to lose myself, I answered. Neither statement canceled the other. That was the tragedy. We discussed the house, whether to sell or refinance. We discussed dividing investments proportionally. We discussed telling the family. It felt less like a breakup and more like dissolving a company we had co-founded. Respectfully, methodically, at one point, he asked, "Are you angry at me?" I paused. No, I said honestly. I'm disappointed in who I allowed myself to become here. That was the part he hadn't anticipated. He thought this was about him. It wasn't. It was about alignment. And alignment, once lost long enough, doesn't regenerate under pressure. By the end of that evening, there were no raised voices, just signatures waiting to happen. He walked me to the bedroom door like he always had. We stood there for a second longer than usual. Is there anything I can say? He asked quietly. I thought about it. If you had asked that a year ago, maybe, I said gently. That wasn't punishment. It was timing. And timing, more than emotion, had decided this outcome. We turned off the lights separately that night, not as enemies, as two people who finally saw each other clearly. Too late to remain the same. I expected the first morning alone to feel dramatic. It didn't. It felt quiet. The apartment was smaller than the house we had shared, but it felt proportionate. Every object inside it had been chosen intentionally. There were no inherited routines here, no unspoken roles waiting to be resumed, just space. I woke up before my alarm out of habit. For a brief second, my body prepared to calculate someone else's schedule. Then I remembered there was no one else to anticipate. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Neutrality. Not loneliness, not triumph, just neutrality. I made coffee in my own kitchen, stood by the window overlooking a street that didn't yet carry shared memories. The air felt different, not because the world had changed, but because I had. The first few weeks weren't cinematic. There were administrative tasks, paperwork, account transfers, conversations with family that required calm explanation rather than defense. Some people were surprised. Some quietly admitted they had sensed something. No one accused, Because I never framed it as failure, I framed it as evolution. At work, I accepted the regional leadership opportunity when it surfaced again. This time, there was no logistical hesitation, no calculation about who would handle everything. And I was capable. The difference now was that my effort expanded me instead of shrinking me. I noticed subtle changes in how I carried myself. I spoke without rehearsing tone. I disagreed without softening language to protect comfort. I rested without guilt, not aggressively, naturally. There were evenings when the silence felt heavy, not because I regretted leaving, but because endings carry weight even when they are correct. I allowed myself to feel that growth without grief is denial, but grief without clarity is confusion. I had clarity. Occasionally, he and I exchanged brief messages about finalizing details. The tone remained respectful, measured. There was no bitterness in my responses. Because I didn't leave to punish him, I left to preserve myself. And that distinction protects peace. The most unexpected transformation wasn't external. It was an internal posture. I no longer entered rooms scanning for tension to manage. I no longer monitored conversations for subtle dismissals. I no longer interpreted my ambition as an inconvenience. I simply existed, fully. And here's what I've learned. When you choose yourself calmly, without spectacle, without revenge, without theatrics, the world doesn't collapse. It reorganizes, friends adjust, family recalibrates, even you recalibrate. There are still moments when I think about the version of us that might have worked under a different awareness, but I don't romanticize it, because I no longer confuse potential with reality. Who I am now is not louder, not harsher, not colder. I am simply aligned. Aligned with my ambition, aligned with my values, aligned with the understanding that love should not require a strategic reduction of self. I used to believe strength meant enduring quietly. Now I understand that strength sometimes means exiting quietly, and there is nothing selfish about refusing to disappear. When I left, no one clapped. There was no cinematic soundtrack, no applause for courage, no dramatic declaration of independence. There was just a woman packing a final box, checking a final document, and closing a door gently behind her. And that's the part I want you to understand. Strength doesn't always look like fire. Sometimes it looks like paperwork, like quiet clarity, like choosing alignment over familiarity. For years, I believed that love meant endurance, that if I could just be patient enough, flexible enough, understanding enough, everything would stabilize into something balanced. But stability without mutual awareness isn't partnership, it's maintenance. And I had mistaken my ability to maintain for proof that everything was healthy. It wasn't, it was functional. There's a difference. I didn't leave because he was cruel. I left because I was shrinking. I didn't leave to teach him a lesson. I left because I finally learned one. Choosing myself felt selfish until it felt necessary. That sentence still matters to me because women like me, steady, competent, emotionally regulated, were often praised for how much we can carry, how little we complain, how gracefully we adjust, but no one asked what it costs. And sometimes the cost is identity. If you're listening to this and thinking, but nothing is that bad, I understand. Nothing was that bad for me either. There was no explosion, just erosion. And erosion is easy to ignore because it's slow. Here's what I know now. You don't need a dramatic betrayal to justify growth. You don't need a villain to validate a departure. And you don't need to hate someone to decide you can no longer be who you are inside a dynamic. Leaving calmly does not mean you care less. It means you thought longer. So I'll leave you with this question not as pressure, not as advice, just as a reflection. Have you ever stayed somewhere not because it was right, but because it was stable? And if stability required you to become smaller, at what point would you decide that choosing yourself isn't selfish? Is it necessary? If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What does choosing yourself mean in your life right now?